Hello, everyone, and welcome to Off the Cuff, where the headlines come to life. And my guest today here in the studio is Sean Christopher Ollie Stone. Welcome, Sean, to Off the Cuff. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Siham.
Sean, you come from a background of filmmakers, and that's what your career is focused on. Give us a little bit of background. You are also Oliver Stone's son, the famous producer, director, and it's in your blood. So talk to us. I know you have a lot of things under your belt. What have you done very recently? Greystone Park and some other things that you're on. You can open the channel and watch you every week, which I do. Some amazing stuff, but you tell us about it.
Okay, well, yes, as far as filmmaking goes, I started out by making the behind the scenes for Alexander, my dad's feature film, back in 2004 when I was still in college. So I did the behind the scenes documentaries on that film. I then did behind the scenes.
So baptism by fire, basically, just threw you right in there.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, having to literally shoot these for Warner Brothers Home Video and being responsible with a certain amount of money to make the documentaries and cut them together and all that. So after doing the Alexander, I went on to do behind the scenes on W, and also I did a short documentary on Nixon for the DVD of Nixon. And from there I went to actually work on the editing side of things with my father, his Untold History of the United States documentary series, 10-part series on Showtime, which is basically more controversial and gets into some of the interesting, his interesting historical perspectives on the United States' interventions, especially its foreign interventions during the Cold War.
So that's a 3-hour show.
No,
right
it's a
there.
10 hours.
It's a 10-hour
show. It's a 10-hour show. Yeah, and so I worked for a year as an editor. I didn't complete. I mean, I wasn't the only editor, but I got a chance to work with him as an editor on that film, and then from there I went to make my own directorial debut, which is called Greystone Park. You mentioned it's a horror film, and here you in Detroit you have a lot of great abandoned locations, factories,
yes.
buildings, and so our story was about exploring a notoriously haunted, abandoned mental facility out in New Jersey. And so my friend who co-wrote the film with me and co-starred in it with me, Alex Wraith, was he was an explorer. He's a New Jersey kid who loved, ghost hunting. I think a lot of people do. And so we had the opportunity to actually go and say, let's have our own ghost adventure. And we lived it, and we made a movie out of our experiences, fictionalized it, obviously.
And that was my next question, fiction or fact?
No, well,
Did you find any ghosts?
It's based, there's more than ghosts.
Okay.
We found more than ghosts. We found a very active, multidimensional universe. And we fictionalized that in the film that came out in 2012. And people can see it, I'm sure, on Netflix or iTunes or however they prefer to watch movies nowadays, because the model of film distribution is changing rapidly. And you're seeing more and more straight-to-video content than you are seeing theatrical releases, which just changes the hopefully
the culture.
Hopefully it democratizes the overall process, and I think that's something
Important.
I can hope for in the future. Would be seeing more film business growing in cities, like Detroit, like Baltimore, and Chicago, and anywhere in the country, because you have a lot of artistic young people, and you see it with the music business, for example. You see young people who get together here in Detroit and they're rapping and they have their own studio at home and they put out their material, and they're not looking for the radio station to make it big. They're basically just going out there and finding each other online. They're making music videos for YouTube, and I think that's a way of challenging the hierarchy of distribution that we're currently facing with these mega corporations that are so globalized. They don't have any consideration or concern for the people of this country, let alone for every city and community they're in. And so I really hope that the future lies in more local economics, basically being involved in the music of your own city and hearing the new flavors and getting fostering the young talent that's available, and in this American landscape that is oftentimes ignored because of the focus on international product, international labor, being labor and production coming from abroad, and the brain drain even of kids who come from, a place like Detroit, and they get drained to Los Angeles. They think they have to go to LA to make it. Motown has to move to LA to be in the hub of it, and I just think that's maybe we're now going to move in the opposite direction in the future and say, wherever you are, you can produce your content, you can tell your stories. You don't need to go to Los Angeles to become a creative artist.
The culture has definitely changed in terms of, as you said, film production. You keynoted the Images and Perceptions Diversity Conference, and we had an individual by the name of Michael Reyes, and we saw him yesterday. But talent like that, he's a rapper, hip hop, but with a conscience for social justice. Like, this individual is so talented. And he's from Metro Detroit, and so he's trying to get that message out. What do you think, since I mean,
he's actually from Chicago, but he moved to Detroit.
Well, we're going to claim him. he's a Detroiter. But
close enough.
When you see talent like this, and when you see what we have in Detroit, we had the film incentive before our governor decided it wasn't the greatest idea, and we were having basically Los Angeles come to us and producing a lot of films, but that's sort of died out. So what do you see as a future here from what you do, what you've seen from Detroit? And I know, we had gone and, looked at some of the dilapidated areas in Metro Detroit.
Right.
What is your vision for that? What do we do with that? I mean, from someone that's coming from that kind of background and looking at what we have in Detroit.
Right.
What are the possibilities?
Well, I mean,
that's a huge
it's
question.
a big question. Like, it's funny. I was talking to somebody. He said LA is kind of like Detroit in the sense that your space in Detroit is about 187 square miles, I believe. It's a massive area, and Los Angeles is basically like that. It's a massive area. Los Angeles County into then Orange County next door, and the greater Inland Empire, and you have this massive space, and so it's basically a collection of townships, and each township then gets its own identity. And so Los Angeles, like Beverly Hills, is a certain culture that's different from Silver Lake, that's different from Midtown, that's different from downtown. And I think that's what could happen in Detroit if the population starts coming back. What's going to bring population back, I believe, is partly, I'm a big believer in infrastructure and investing in basically big infrastructure projects, like, for example, high-speed rail systems to connect what used to be called the Midwest of, from Chicago to Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, and to Baltimore, and even if you want to go south to as far as New Orleans, but to connect cities again, because when people see, when they see, for example, the monorail system here in Detroit, that already implies economic investment, and that implies that people are moving. It means that businesses can come in, and there's some future prosperity that's available. And so you have to make infrastructure.
But it's such on a limited level here in Metro Detroit.
Yeah, of course, but it doesn't matter because
corridor,
it's literally just it's basically saying, look, there is investment in future, and whenever people see investment into infrastructure and transportation, it means people are going to start moving there. And then what happens is you employ people in the process of building these things. You could retool the auto sector and do monorails and magnetic levitation trains, for example, and actually start to connect the country again, and basically take us away from our dependence on trucking and auto purposes for transporting goods, for example, and people, and also airplanes for transporting people for these kind of distances. We're talking of less than 1,000 miles here. So I'm all for high-speed rail, and again, using that as a way of getting people excited about the fact that Detroit is right next to Chicago, and so you can jump on a high-speed train and be there in less than 2 hours. You realize you're neighbors, and then
we got the Amtrak.
And again, as you get investment in things like infrastructure, it creates jobs. The jobs also and the infrastructure allows for markets to come up. People can then spend their money, and new businesses come into that area, and that's how Detroit was built. Detroit was the wealthiest city in America in 1960 as far as average wages were concerned. It was tremendously wealthy, and that's because when you have an auto sector that's paying union wages, those guys are going to spend it at restaurants, at bars, on the local economy, right? And it's not just the auto. Auto was employing all kinds of workers from lights to to fabrics to tires production. I mean, steel mills. Everything was working hand in hand. So we have to conceive of the idea that this is it's a national economy that has to be revived, but it also requires local economics, and that's where it comes down to every neighborhood, so that you can have people, for example, buying locally brewed beers, drinking locally brewed beers, buying locally grown food, for example, going back to the nature of economics being more of a local thing, so that which you can grow in your backyard, you eat. If you can't grow it in your backyard, that's when you need to have a trade policy. But our free trade practices have been so insane that it's basically discouraging everything you can produce at home to say, well, we can get it cheaper from abroad. Well, in the process of getting it cheaper from abroad, you're also cheapening your overall.
Itself,
well, you're cheapening your actual cost of labor, and so these people have never recovered from their loss of wages. The only thing that made it seem like it was okay was the fact that we had access to credit. So as long as you had a credit card system that was in place, and the banking system that was lending people money, it ameliorated the fact that we had lost real wages for the last 40 years. And that's undoubted, undisputable. We have lost since 1973. On the average, everyone in this country has lost real wage power.
And that's basically gotten us to where we're at right now. And we have a lot of area to cover in regards to revitalizing a lot of the cities. And of course, Detroit's Motown. So, I think it was a design that we did not have, the transportation systems that every other metropolitan city has. But you're so knowledgeable of these issues. You've been in front of the camera and you've been behind the camera. I know you and Angela were talking shop in regards to editing and what have you, but you're in front of the camera a lot too. Buzzsaw is a show that you do, and also watching The Hawk on RT. And the subjects that you talk about are very much what we were talking about right now, a lot of social issues, a lot of issues dealing with social justice. Why is that your focus? Your inspiration for that focus, which is so needed. It's sort of in your face. This is reality. This is true. This is fact. So, what was your driving force in pursuing that kind of programming, and what kind of a change do you feel that people watching? Is it like an aha moment? Is it like, yes, that makes sense? Yeah.
Hopefully. Buzzsaw is the show that I've been doing since about 2013, so over 2 years now, and it's an online interview program where I've had the opportunity to just interview guests on topics that are interesting to me, and some of the guests can be far out there for people, and even for myself, I don't necessarily agree with everything they're presenting, but I say it's a platform where you can come and speak your truth.
See different perspectives.
And it's important that we see different perspectives, because that's part of the game of what's created, especially in a country like America, where we are a bit shut off from the rest of the world, by the seas, but also by our wealth and the privilege and the overall arrogance that comes with it when you have a wealthy tradition in the 20th century.
That's a choice, though. I think that's a choice.
So we've allowed ourselves to be cut off. Mainstream media does a good job of it. The ownership of we know of these conglomerates is so concentrated that you really don't get much real perspective. Most networks get talking points every day, and those are the issues that they focus on throughout the day on the news. And so it's given from the top down. And on a show like Watching the Hawks for RT, that's people say Russia Today, it must be propaganda. Well, far from it. We actually produce our show. Myself and the co-hosts, we have our opinions on the matters we want to discuss, and whether we're wrong or right, we're pundits, we're young commentators, but we have a perspective, and it's hopefully going to be different than what you're going to see from the traditional left-right
CNN
paradigm.
ABC.
That's what they create. They create paradigms of reality, and I say they're creating reality that has nothing to do with reality. And the problem is that people who are isolated, as we are even in our own country, because it's a very big country. So if you're in a city like Detroit, you may rarely interface with people from Los Angeles or ever go there even. And you name it, like all these different cities in this country don't necessarily know what's going on. Even in your own city, you don't necessarily go to the poorer parts of town if you're living in an affluent area.
Sure.
And so as a result, you don't really know what's going on in the world. So that's where the media comes in. They try to create, I call the alternate reality that's nothing to do with reality. It basically, they tell you this is the culture, this is the reality of medicinal products you have to purchase on advertising space, and you have to buy a car every the commercial break. It's like they're selling you a car, and they're selling you a worldview about basically who's the bad guy this week, and how the stock market is doing, because that's the life or death of the working man. It has nothing to do with most Americans. Most Americans aren't aren't how do you say, aren't really being affected by the stock market in the sense of their actual wage. They might be because of the corporations' overall control. How do you say, the corporations are so bloated, they're so global that they will have impact on the real economy. But when it comes down to it, if these massive corporations were to be broken apart again, America would be fine. We have the manpower, we have the infrastructure, we have the resources available to us. We could rebuild this country without these global corporations who have no allegiance to us.
Well, what did you think about the bank bailout?
It was ridiculous. It was ridiculous because why should the banks, who because of the end of Glass-Steagall are able to use our depositor money to make speculative basically play speculation games and basically over leverage themselves, when it comes time for them basically to face the consequence of this mass debt bubble that they had created, they then said that the average taxpayer had to be responsible for their speculation, right? And it's just this overall culture of corporate socialism. You see it in the military-industrial complex all the time. You see these weapons companies and whatnot who are getting, or contractors like Halliburton's and whatnot who are getting these massive deals from the United States corporation. The United States corporation being the government, right? Making deals with these guys, giving them checks to continue to continue to hire and arm. And they say, well, we're employing people. It's like, yeah, but you're employing people in industries. If you are, you're employing them in industries that are only designed to produce weapons that ultimately must destroy, as opposed to employing people in industries like building infrastructure that actually creates peace and prosperity for generations to come, because you're actually building something that has a viable future, that actually will return profits that can retire themselves over the long term, over 50 years. That's the way we have to think, is America 50 years from now, 100 years from now. We forgot about that. We only think about America from election to election, from quarter to quarter, as far as the stock reports are concerned. But that's my point. Why is it these global corporations have become such a steadying influence on American life, and they have no connection to America anymore? At least if we had tariffs and these mass corporations had to, for example, employ people locally, and for distribution they had to partner with corporations in those other countries for distribution, then I would understand. At least we could say they're American corporations. These corporations have no relationship to the countries anymore. They're simply interested in profit, and you might see some spillover as far as technology is concerned on the IT side of things. You got a smaller iPhone, or a smarter iPhone this year. Those are the kind of things you see. But as far as the overall gain of our potential science and technology development, I don't see it as far as what we could be as a country that had built the first rail systems, from sea to sea, that now we are so dependent upon cars for getting around from place to place. You see roads in disrepair, meanwhile. You see your infrastructure falling apart, levees breaking, obviously in New Orleans, and yet every year we get D+ ratings from the Army Corps of Engineers, but no one actually says, hey, why don't we make $1 trillion investment in that as opposed to $1 trillion investment
in our military,
in waging wars to control access to resources and that we don't even necessarily need, because we could be off oil. We could have been off oil as soon as we entered the nuclear era. We could have been off oil for the most part, but we're still caught up in these, the control of raw materials and natural resources, because it's much easier to manipulate currencies and to manipulate people when you can create artificial scarcities. Right?
Absolutely. And common sense seems to be missing in a lot of things, and even mainstream news. Pundits are using the jargon and the rhetoric of every other station. What is and you touched a little bit on this, but what is different about your approach to film and to television? Watching The Hawk on RT. Now, what is the theme of that? And I know it talks about, and I love this kind of stuff. It's sort of in your face. These are the facts. This is what's happening. And even if it negates what the rhetoric is for all the other shows, what kind of response do you get, and how do you think that is changing the overall image of filmmaking, news reporting, shows that we watch that sort of brainwash us and sort of make us feel like robots and accepting whatever is being told to us?
Yeah, I don't
how's
have
the
much
change
hope.
going?
I don't have much hope for
Oh no, don't
TV,
say that.
TV-based media.
Okay.
I really just don't think that it much matters. And You know, it's unfortunate that RT doesn't have more impact in America. Globally, thankfully, we have 700 million households, or I think, or TV sets that have RT as a station. So you go to I've traveled in Europe and Asia and Australia, and I have friends there as well who all tell me, "Oh, I saw your show," and it's like that's the reach of RT. It's all across the world.
Sure.
And that's what's beautiful about it, is that we can have an opinion and a voice that's going to resonate with people globally, whereas maybe in America people don't know RT exists and they have to buy it, especially on their satellite. So for me, it's not TV media that's going to do the real job, or let's say that's really going to serve the justice of situations, of analyzing situations. It's the fact that most millennials and even Gen Yers, let's say, up to a certain age, are getting most of their information online. The fact is they're not watching CNN.
So do you think it's becoming obsolete
Fox
a little
News.
bit?
I mean,
for
Fox
the new
News
generations?
demographic is like mostly over 65. So the young people are getting their information from news shows, from word of mouth, from Facebook, from other forums. And as a result, they're starting to understand and that there's different perspectives, there are conspiracies. I think it's becoming more acceptable in society. And that is
People
an
want to know
important
more.
shift that you have to understand, that there's a power structure at play, and the power structure wants you to believe in the alternate reality I was talking about that they create, where it's like, this is the way of the world, and it's the one you see through the box. And people are starting to say, well, if that's the way of the world, that world is either a complete joke or completely screwed up, or a complete fiction and fantasy that I can't relate to. And so as a result, they're having to look to other places to find their information. So watching the Hawks is one of those places. But again, it's just part of this overall shift away from buying into the mainstream BS.
Absolutely. The world is sort of in chaos right now. What's been happening in Paris, what happened in Beirut, what happened in, what's happening all around our country, and the news items and the stories. What is your vision, and what do you think is going on? And that's a pretty loaded question too. But where do we go from here, and how do we deal with something like that? I mean, you have the fear factor, you have the news stations, of course, feeding into that, but you also have reality. So how do we deal with that as individuals? Looking towards that media to give us some kind of direction.
Right. Well, I mean, you talk about Paris, for example, and the bombings in Beirut, and you can say, well, it boils down to ISIS as this fanatical group of Sunni Muslims, a lot of whom were organized after Saddam was overthrown. A lot of his Ba'ath Party military that everyone said was insane to just completely disarm and basically tell them to go on their way and not employ them in any meaningful fashion. Everyone at the time said this is an insane strategy, right? They end up seeming to be a lot of the base army for what has now become the Islamic State. Financing comes from probably Saudi Arabia and other UAE countries, Arab countries, and then the overall supply line market for their oil goes through Turkey, a major base of operations for them. And it's all part of the overall plan to destabilize Assad, the same way in Syria, the same way that Saddam Hussein was destabilized in Iraq. And if Assad had been destabilized as quickly as Saddam had been destabilized, you'd probably end up with just as much chaos in the Middle East as you saw after Iraq, but actually even probably worse, because now Syria, it would be in conflict. Lebanon would be drawn into it. It could spill all the way into Israel, as far as the spillover of it. Jordan could be affected. Turkey, it would it could completely. You have to redraw the map for the region, but that's all to simply say we can't keep poking at this thing as though it's a simple, those are the bad guys, let's go take them out. You see, that's the fiction that the media has created, going back to 9/11, and actually it was before 9/11, because you have to understand, I think, you have to understand the Middle East policy longer term. You have to, you can go back to colonialism and understand how
that's one of
the British and the French carved up these countries.
I'll never understand Middle East politics. I don't care.
Because, again, you had British and French colonials carving up countries for the sake of oil, and putting, for example, the Saudis in charge of Arabia, which we know, the Saudis are notoriously one of the most extreme practitioners of Islam in a way that
I think
many
that
people don't
conversation is
recognize.
happening more so now than ever before,
Right.
which is a good thing.
So in the context of a lot of games that have been played, remember that the Middle East was, if you go back to, I think the heart of it is, it was called the heartland of the world in this game that Mackinder and other British imperialists were talking about vis-a-vis the Russian Empire. And it goes back as far as the Crimean War, which was actually the Turks fighting against the Russians.
Sure.
And now we're on the brink of the same thing with the Turks shooting down the Russian airplane. So in this basically this geopolitical struggle for the control of the heartland of the world, which is the underbelly of Russia, China, Europe, it comes through the Suez Canal, which is Egypt, Israel, the Middle East. It goes west to Turkey. It goes east to Pakistan and India, right? And so you could look at the entire strategy going back to 77, 78 of a bunch of Harvard and British intelligence people like Bernard Lewis, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Sam Huntington, and they basically concoct this notion of clash of civilizations and the arc of crisis, what they call it. And basically at that time, it was to foment more radical forms of Islam, which they'd done before. They'd used the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, against Nasser first, and then Sadat in Egypt, because Nasser was a very pro-nationalist minded leader, and they wanted to utilize the more radical forms of religion to mobilize terrorist groups, basically, to destabilize long-term economic policies. Again, you utilize terrorism oftentimes to either destroy infrastructure or create such fear in investing that it basically creates a war economy or a security state economy. So I think that they used this strategy in the Middle East, going back to that time period, as a way of keeping that area unstable so that all Russian and Russian-Chinese policies would have to be destabilized as a result. Like that was what they called the arc of crisis, was use the Muslim fanatics, to basically destabilize Russia's southern border. What the Chechens, for example, have been doing since '94. Some might say, yeah, they have a valid right to self-determination, but on the other hand, isn't it also potentially better for them to be working with Russia as a sovereign entity than trying to splinter off and secede? It would be
Absolutely.
like saying, Turkey should secede from America. So there's a lot of desire to create conflict and embroil this region because of an overall imperial strategy vis-a-vis the Russians and then also the Chinese, who they seem to be more and more alliance with, especially going back to this BRICS bank, the Bank of Russia, India, China, Brazil.
This information is priceless, but what concerns me is that the individuals who don't have that background, who don't have that astute sense of history and facts, only see what's going on, and there is a fear right now, and having that information and being knowledgeable really sort of dissolves that fear, and I think that is the key to educating yourself and finding out some more information, and it's the need to know factor. We need to know more. We can't just expect or accept everything that we listen to. I know your shows have a different perspective, and they analyze everything, which is really important. Buzzsaw and watching the Hawks. Sean Stone straight from Los Angeles. Really happy to have you here and to share your perspective, your knowledgeable perspective. It's really impressive to see someone who really knows their stuff and who's actually talking about it there on the media so people can listen and get the facts. So thank you so much for being here. I hope you'll come back again. I know you're doing a special project, and we'll talk about that later on when you get a little bit more involved in it. I hope you'll come back and talk to us about it and tell us how it's going. All righty, wonderful. Welcome to Detroit, and we will see you next time. Thanks for being with us on Off the Cuff.